So this next session is all about scaling. We heard a little bit about scaling in that first plenary, and now we're going to really dive in to talk more about scaling. So this crowd is no stranger to the idea that the human enterprise both impacts and depends on nature, and also no stranger to the idea that a better understanding of the ways in which nature sustains and fulfills human life can target investments that can, at the same time, help both people and nature thrive together. As a community of practice, we've been working together with leaders of countries, companies, and communities, and also finance institutions to change systems and to change thinking. So we're working together to create stories of success that can serve as inspiration for others. And also we're working together to create new pathways to do things differently. And people are doing that in their own geographies and their own contexts. But now we want to talk about how do we scale this up to fundamentally transform systems. So this session brings together leaders from key institutions who've moved this field in real ways from ideas to implementation, who see the big picture and who are really making things happen. And they all give me great hope that we can and we are making a difference together to mainstream the values of nature into decisions to create a more sustainable future. So it is my pleasure to introduce this esteemed panel. And our first speaker is Aileen Lee, the president of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Aileen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to Stanford and the Natural Capital Alliance for hosting this symposium today. It is wonderful to be here and a privilege to help open this plenary session on using natural capital understanding to transform finance and policy decisions at scale. I want to begin by offering my congratulations to the Natural Capital Alliance community. This gathering marks more than just another annual meeting. It's an important milestone, 20 years of work to change how the world understands nature, values nature, and makes decisions with nature's at its core. That's worth celebrating. The Natural Capital Project started 20 years ago to help bring the world around to the simple but powerful idea that nature is not outside the economy and it's not an externality. It's the foundation on which development, prosperity, resilience, and human well-being depend. And the Natural Capital Project was fueled by the recognition that for too long, our systems of policy, planning, and finance have treated nature as if it were invisible or worse yet, dispensable. It was built around a vision for transforming the system by nurturing partnerships that would help bridge knowledge to action, deploying practical, science-informed, decision-ready tools to help governments, businesses, and communities make better choices for sustained prosperity. And the good news is that this community has demonstrated that this is more than just possible. When done right, it's inspirational. And I know the expert speakers who will follow me will be sharing case studies that will give us a window into what success looks like for mainstreaming natural capital into policy and finance. I'm looking forward to hearing those stories and learning from their experiences. I am not an expert, but I'm here today on behalf of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation as a proud supporter of NatCap's work and to share our gratitude for what has been accomplished, but also to call on this community in this moment to recommit, to raise our collective ambition, and to consider how we might collaborate with even greater purpose towards driving change with speed and scale. Because the work represented in this room has never been more urgent nor more possible. Indeed, the Natural Capital Project's evolution into the Natural Capital Alliance reflects a recognition of this challenge and a commitment to activating a global network of partnerships aimed at systemic, large-scale change that we need. This means moving from individual projects to national work that takes a whole of government economy-wide approach. It means moving from pilots to institutionalized practice, from isolated success stories to shared standards, common tools, and durable capacity. All of this is needed if we're going to integrate natural capital into the everyday machinery of development policy and finance. Indeed, that's the central challenge before us, not to simply protect nature as an exceptional demonstration project, but to transform the systems in ways that reinforce these decisions and make this understanding of natural capital not only feasible, but inevitable. So as we enter today's conversation, I hope we'll consider 3 questions. What would it look like to meaningfully raise our ambition? How would we know that we had succeeded? And of course, maybe the most important question for this community, what are the ways that collaboration can help us realize that ambition? Let's turn to that first question. What would it look like to meaningfully raise our ambition for this next phase of work? What would it mean for natural capital to move from being evidence that decision makers may consider to being a core part of the rules by which public and private capital is allocated? Can we go beyond making natural capital visible to making it consequential, consistently changing the choices about which infrastructure projects, which land use decisions proceed, which companies receive financing, and how risk is priced in and made something that's investable and manageable? And though we've achieved much through voluntary action, I also wonder whether we should be asking whether the conditions are ripe to begin moving from making natural capital a voluntary input to one that's a required input in decision-making. There's more momentum across sectors for this work than ever before, with TNFD giving regulators and firms a practical starting framework, and Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework articulating the aspiration for a policy vision where large corporations, financial institutions would be mandated to disclose biodiversity-related risks, dependencies, and impacts. What would it look like to fully realize this momentum? And then, if we were to achieve these aspirations, what would success look like? One measure would have to be to look at how harmful incentives begin to shift. The 2023 UNEP report estimated over $7 trillion in nature-negative subsidies. A major test would be whether we can shift those flows towards nature-positive investments. But I think we also have to imagine success in the form of natural capital solutions that are institutionalized and the province not just of environment ministers, but finance ministers, ideally leading whole-of-government approaches. Today, our work often relies on individual champions, often those environment ministers, but our success stories show that the path to scale looks different when finance ministers and the whole of their governments are engaged. What makes that possible? Changing their cost of capital, creating investable assets that unlock private sector investment at a larger scale. How can we make the full adoption of these natural capital approaches an irresistible competitive advantage for these countries? And how do we then embed these practices into their institutions in ways that withstand political turnover? Finally, I'd like to turn to the third and maybe the most important question for this community, which is what are the significant ways that we can strengthen collaboration to realize these raised ambitions? And to start, I think maybe the logical extension of that question is, what would it look like to collaborate not just around innovation of natural capital understanding, but in really working together to drive adoption? Innovation brought us a long way. It's given us the science, the models, the tools, and the proof points. But the next phase requires something different. It requires coalitions that can move natural capital from a technical, feasible possibility to an institutional requirement. I think we have to ask whether it's time to have more convergence around standards that allow for practical, decision-ready methods. A persistent barrier to mandatory adoption has been the perception that natural capital methods can be complex, bespoke, or even contested. Collaboration can focus on making methods easier to use, easier to audit, and easier to integrate into existing decision processes. The question is not whether methods can be perfect, but whether they can be trusted enough to be incorporated into real policy and finance decisions. And a key element of this is building the shared data infrastructure that makes the capacity for action really accessible. Countries need permanent natural capital data systems, not just pilot reports. This means open geospatial data tools and other inputs. And the accelerating availability of AI-powered solutions can certainly help us translate existing tools into this capacity at even greater speed. And then, of course, considering how we collaborate across sectors to drive change at this greater scale. One thing that's particularly exciting about the Natural Capital Alliance is that it's already a multi-stakeholder alliance spanning the public, private, and civil society sectors. This puts us in a position to connect the dots and come together to scale solutions. I'm particularly encouraged by the leadership of the MDBs in this community, many of whom I think we'll be hearing from shortly. MDBs occupy a unique position in the global system. They aren't just lenders, they are standard setters, they are conveners, and they shape the planning and policy choices of governments. They help determine which risks are visible, which benefits are counted, and which investments become bankable. Under the leadership of the MDBs and the alliance with the other sectors in this room, we can unlock system transformation by bringing the pieces together in a way that allows change to consistently scale up. In closing, as I was reflecting on the moment that we're in, navigating an era where public discourse around environmental issues can feel particularly fractious and polarized, I think it's easy to lose sight of how much we all hold in common. No one wants to live in a world with polluted air, dirty water, and barren earth. And everyone wants a world that's prosperous and secure. And yet, despite those trade-offs, we find ourselves locked into systems that make bad choices, leaving our collective natural inheritance more depleted with each passing generation. It's frustrating because, as we'll see in this room, there's no shortage of innovations and solutions that show us that that brighter future is possible, but they do remain just tantalizingly out of reach unless we can find the collective action to unlock change at the speed and scale that's needed. When I look out at this community, I trust that you all have the ingredients to help us lead the way, and we're happy to be part of supporting the Natural Capital Alliance's efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Aileen. Next up, we have Gregory Watson, the Chief of the Biodiversity and Natural Capital Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank.
Hello, thanks everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Juan Pablo said, kind of set me up very well, so I'm going to go into a bit more details on some of the things he was mentioning, because at the IDB, we're starting from a very clear premise. Biodiversity is not a side issue. It's natural, social, and economic infrastructure, and if we want to finance development in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have to finance the natural capital that makes it possible. And so the question no longer is, how much does it cost to protect nature? The question is, how much of development and livelihoods becomes impossible when nature is lost? And so that's why I don't want to just talk about pilots, but on the larger question of how these pilots become systems. How natural capital moves from evidence to policy to finance and then impact at scale. And for us, that begins at the strategic level. For the first time, the IDB institutional strategy includes nature both as a vertical area for investment, but also a horizontal area for mainstreaming. And that's a shift from treating nature as a purely environmental issue to really recognizing it as an asset that countries use to advance their goals. From there, and I'm going to kind of walk you through the how these things happen, because I think that's important. We build internal architecture in MDBs. We have a thematic framework document and an action plan. The thematic framework document really is the analytical foundation, and the central theme is mainstreaming. And it's looking at challenges such as governance, looking at challenges such as pollution, looking at finance gaps. And then we have an action plan. That's the how are we going to do it? How is the team that I lead going to advance bringing biodiversity and natural capital into our operations? How is it going to generate country-specific knowledge? We're doing studies right now on repurposing agricultural subsidies to basically have positive impacts for nature, as an example. How do we promote and mobilize resources towards biodiversity and natural capital? And in an MDB, this all starts with our country strategies. And that's when we engage with the countries about, as Juan Pablo said, what are their priorities? Our team never sits down with a country and says, you have to do all of these things for nature. No, we say, what are you as a country trying to achieve? And then we say, well, have you thought that nature is very important here in providing these services? Or that there's a risk to nature here, and that nature is providing these livelihoods, and really making that kind of argument. So far, we've done this in 12 countries. This is a rolling process. And so we're integrating this in the country strategies. Because once you have the country strategies, you create the operational model to actually do this. A dedicated unit, regional focal points in the countries themselves, thematic focal points who focus on nature-based solutions, who focus on capital markets, and work with those other sectors of the bank who are our brothers and sisters in this work. And that allows us not only to work deeply with the countries, but transversally across the institution as a whole. And the institutional architecture matters. It sounds very dry because natural capital doesn't scale one project at a time. It needs to become part of the institutional machinery, part of the policy priorities, part of the policy dialogue. And it becomes systematic when that natural capital is mainstreamed into the investment systems, the medium-term fiscal frameworks, debt sustainability analysis, national policies. So that's a bit where we're going there. We see our action plan developing results. Under the action plan, we've delivered 100% of our outputs. We've mobilized, as Juan Pablo said, last year we did $1.8 billion of our portfolio was nature, that's about 10%. We mobilized an additional $750 million from external sources, not from donors, but from the markets. And we've worked with over 10,000 shareholders. So you show that you can actually do this when you put the systems in place. And the system depends on three interrelated pillars: policy, finance, and data. Policy creates the enabling conditions. Finance turns the ambition into investable structures, and data gives the governments and investors the confidence to act. So the first pillar is policy, because it only changes when the fiscal managers and the ministries of finance and the places where countries make decisions incorporate these topics. Our role is to help the countries move step by step from looking at the evidence to bringing it to policy, from bringing it to policy to fiscal and planning systems, bringing that to the investment system. And in practice, we do that through policy-based lending, where we require policy change in order for a loan from the bank to be implemented, by providing advisory services, analytics, and combining that all together to make this kind of data useful in the context of a project. We also help countries design the fiscal and financial tools to make the agenda operational. Budget tagging, incentives, green finance taxonomies, sustainable finance frameworks. And we do that by bringing the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment together. We're moving from analytics to structured investments, building bankable, nature-positive pipelines of scale, and mobilize public and private finance through blended finance, through guarantees, through other instruments. And that's why ministries of finance are so critical. That's where the fiscal policy, the debt, the budgets, the public investment decisions come together. Our Ministries of Finance platform is a key entry point. Since 2022, it's created a country-led space for policy dialogue, peer exchange, technical analytics, and implementation. It engages 17 countries. It's trained more than 185 officials, so not just the ministers, but the people who work in the ministries, and supported 23 fiscal initiatives. This includes the analysis of macro fiscal issues, debt sustainability analysis, what is the cost of capital to a country if their natural resource base is degraded? That starts to open really interesting conversations with policymakers. And they start to treat biodiversity as an economic asset that's not only important for their resilience, but also for their livelihoods. Then if we look at innovative finance, The policy creates the conditions, finance turns those conditions into investment. We've mapped a range of innovative and not so innovative financial products, because it's not just about doing the cool, sexy new thing, it's also about applying kind of boring financial instruments in a new way. How can we mobilize this? The IDB is active across all of these different financing structures, but I'm going to focus a little bit on two. And the two that I'm going to talk about are important because they create that DNA in the country between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment. We were the first MDB to support a debt for nature swap with a policy-based guarantee, and we've been involved in 5 of the 10 last transactions since 2022, and all but 1 in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's mobilized more than $2 billion in private capital for these operations. And the shift is that this becomes a part of the country's fiscal and investment strategy. Moving beyond the debt for nature swaps, we see paying for verified results, outcomes funds. We're doing this at different scales. At the continental level, we've created a Jaguar Impact Fund with Colombia that's working along the Jaguar corridor that pays for results around KPIs for an umbrella species and landscapes. But we're moving now to link that with results-based bonds. So when you have investors that are willing to forego part of a coupon that can generate nature gains through a concrete project, usually philanthropy has to pay that result. But what if we issued biodiversity credits through a habitat bank and those pay back the investors? It becomes a closed private system and you don't have to rely on philanthropy. But for any of this to work, and as Aileen mentioned, we need to have harmonized metrics and guidance. We, on behalf of the other MDBs, worked to look at 700 different frameworks of metrics for nature, worked with investors like BNP Paribas, UBS, TNFD, ICMA, and we worked at NGOs, governments, to say, what is the critical path to pick the most important ones that investors understand and to use those as your KPI? So we published this at COP30, and it's available for anybody who's a project developer to try to make this faster, because we saw in our own projects, doing it one at a time doesn't cut it. So just to kind of get towards the closing here, we have a distinct role. We need to bring policy, finance, and data together to connect, to convene governments, to turn methodologies into usable systems, and to mobilize and de-risk financing. But we can't do it alone. It's when we work with partners like NatCap to bring the technical depth, the data, the credibility, and then the governments bring the ownership and the policy capacity. Philanthropy and donors bring the catalytic capital. Private investors can bring the scale. So we can bring everybody together. We've tested this in a number of different pilots. I'm not going to go through all of them right now because there's going to be a session about this tomorrow. But through this partnership with the Jeff and Stanford, we've done this in 5 countries. But beyond that, what we've done is to develop a harmonized toolkit that anybody could use that builds off of the lessons of these projects. And so I'm going to skip through. There's individual case studies for each of the countries. I urge you to come to the session tomorrow where the countries are going to be talking about what they're doing, because it's very interesting. But maybe I'll take 1 second here for Belize because it touches something else that Aileen mentioned. Belize is maybe one of the more interesting ones because it shows the full pathway. Belize pilot developed KPIs for blue economy, linking ecosystem health to socioeconomic outcomes, a monitoring system, and also a centralized dashboard that shows how all of this links to different sectors of the economy and jobs. And then beyond that pilot, that MRV system connects government agencies like coastal zone management, fisheries, and blue economy together. And that then allows you to both have adaptive policy, but also to think of new financial instruments that are built off of this dashboard and these metrics that you can report. So I'm going to skip the rest of these case studies. I urge you to come to the event tomorrow. But to scaling beyond these cases, we mentioned earlier we've developed a 20-hour self-paced free MOOC that translates all of these methodologies to make natural capital approaches usable, not just for analysis, but for policy planning and investment decisions. It's built about these real country case studies, and it's designed for scale. It's available on IDB Academy, our MOOC platform. And it's not just a training, it's for ministries of finance, it's for ministries of environment to turn knowledge into capacity. And then we've developed a scaling package, which is a set of practical tools, methodologies, and guidance that systematizes all of these pilots into replicable, rapid methodologies that any country can use. So together, it goes beyond the country experiences into how this replicates at scale. And so I'm going to close here. What does this all add up to in the end? It means we move from understanding nature as something to measure to making that understanding useful, to transforming the systems that shape development decisions. It means natural capital moves through a new pathway, from science to strategy to institutions, from institutions to dialogue, from country dialogue to pilots, from pilots to metrics, from metrics to finance, and finance to scale. That's what we need to turbocharge here, and that's where we need to go in 20 years, I'd say. We need to use nature to strengthen development. And it's not just to prove that nature matters. The group here has achieved that. I think you can all give yourselves a hand because you have achieved really making it clear that nature matters. But then how do we bring it all together so that countries can plan, invest, finance, and grow? I think that's where we need to go next. Thanks.
Thank you, Greg. One small correction, that session that he mentioned that will go into more detail on those cases is this afternoon. Okay, next up we have Naryan Iyer, who is hopefully still awake. He's the Principal Natural Resources and Agricultural Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. And has a particularly bad case of jet lag.
Thank you, Anne. You were loud enough, actually, so I did wake up. I think Anne has introduced me, and Greg has done a really fantastic job in explaining what MDBs really do. So what you're going to hear from me about ADB is probably, old wine in a new bottle. And Greg has made my job pretty easy. So I'm not going to show all the slides that I have. And I'm going to focus really on what, the tweaks that ADB has been making, which are relevant to our own Asia and the Pacific region, to scale up natural capital approaches. So as the plenary session, says, what are we trying to do to scale up these things? We've done pilots. We've been talking about this for a long time. We've been engaging with countries. We've been engaging with our private sector clients on various issues around natural capital. And Greg mentioned those pilots that were done under the JEF, and 5 of those countries were ADB countries. So where do we go from here? So that was what consumed our thinking, our energies for some time. And what we thought is, as MDBs are very, very good at, systematically trying to do things, creating frameworks, creating methodologies to do whatever we want to do. So we have, and Ching-Feng in the previous plenary alluded to that, we have devised a framework which we call a natural capital guidance framework, which we are kind of using to inform our efforts to scale up natural capital investments in the region. So if I can request whoever is moving the slides to go to slide 4, unless I'm doing it myself. One before this. Well, it won't be too long, don't worry. So, we've had many such initiatives across different topics. But what we felt and what was really relevant for us at this point in time for natural capital was to systematically figure out where we go from here. And this natural capital guidance note that we have published 3 months ago looks at it as a matrix of pillars, 4 pillars that inform the different objectives and the different types, components of this guidance, and the stages of typically project or operation cycles. So let me just explain this approach. What we are trying to do through this is rather than treat natural capital as one different kind of sector or topic, we're trying to embed it across the entire investment cycle that we usually have, and I think Greg mentioned that as well towards the end. So if I go, along the y-axis, so at the upstream, we're looking at the country level. We're looking at the country diagnostics. We're looking at country partnership strategies, as we call it at ADB. And we're using the tools and methodologies, the counting, the assessments, to inform these country partnership strategies. And through these, we would also look at, we have this whole approach, landscape approach, which I'll briefly talk about later. So we're trying to use this to also do landscape diagnostics. So at a really, larger level, the midstream level supports policy dialogue, supports investment planning, supports, along with policy, maybe the need for regulatory reforms. And with this objective in mind, this would support country studies, sector studies, project level assessments, and try to include land use, biodiversity calculations, and public investment planning, all at the midstream level. Now, when we go to downstream, we are going further down, further narrowing it further, going further micro, and use assessments to directly influence project design. And we have some examples, which even our countries can talk about. Economic analysis, building in safeguards analysis, monitoring, so on and so forth. So looking at upstream, midstream, downstream is really looking at it at a very large scale and then narrowing down to project level. Now, if you look at the pillars, the pillar 1 is all about the assessments leading to accounting, maybe leading to valuations, and using that to inform the work that we do at all 3 stages. So we've been working with the Natural Capital project for many years now. We've been fortunate to have their guidance, and we're using these models that have been developed in our projects to help design better projects, to help implement them as well. This pillar also supports our emphasis, as I mentioned, on landscape approaches. So what we want to encourage is, rather than look at different ecosystems separately, we want to look at all ecosystems that matter in a particular region together as a landscape. And we're increasingly viewing river basins as something that we would anchor our landscape approach around. And river basins that extend right from source to sea, if you may. So it would include coastal systems, it would include mountain systems, forests, anything that comes within that whole set of ecosystems. And we have different programs that we're calling for different regions of Asia and the Pacific. We have Ridge to Reef in South Asia. We have a Resilient River Basin Initiative in Southeast. We have Glacier to Farms in Central and West. These are all similar landscape approaches, varying, tweaked for the vagaries of that particular region. The second pillar focuses, on financing, mobilizing investments. So using these assessments to maybe design projects that are more bankable, identifying appropriate sources of revenue, sources of cash flows in project by demonstrating measurable economic benefits, and using that to convince our clients as well on the need to go ahead with specific investments. The third pillar is creating the enabling environment for natural capital. So we recognize that these technical tools, this innovative financing designs, these structures, they're not sufficient. So countries also need stronger institutions, better policies, improved governance, and regulatory frameworks. So through our various modalities, be them technical assistance or maybe policy-based loans or results-based lending, we want to support governments to achieving this enablers, to creating these environments where natural capital investments could be scaled up. And the fourth pillar focuses on knowledge, partnerships, and capacity building. The reason why we are here as well, and why we are also proud to be a part of the Natural Capital Alliance. I mean, as all of us recognize, no one institution can do this on their own, and that's exactly why we're working together. So all this, we would like to bring together all the 4 pillars across all the 3 phases and try and scale up our investments in natural capital across the region. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Naryan. Next up, we have Erik Berglof, who's the Chief Economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting us to this incredible family. I have been here once before. I was one of those who put up their hand. I had been here before. But what I think this is almost, I go to a lot of meetings, but it's very rarely that you have this sense of common purpose, the sense of warmth also for newcomers like myself and my institution. So I very much appreciate the family that Gretchen and her team have produced. So we are indeed very much a newcomer. You heard from 2 institutions that have taken this, through this whole journey and making it mainstream. And that's very much the journey that we are on. And it's, it's not trivial to get this done, but we are very committed. We did it in climate. We committed that we would have more than 50% climate finance by 2025. We now have more than 70% of climate finance. We actually the MDB with the highest share of climate finance. We took it through, from thought leadership to projects to policy-based lending, and that's exactly what we have to do now on nature nature as well. So we started with thought leadership. So and last time I was here, I had the chance to present this idea of nature as infrastructure. Obviously, it's not a new idea, but you can imagine for an infrastructure investment bank to take that approach, that's saying that nature is infrastructure. It's, in fact, the most important infrastructure that sustains all economic activity and, of course, life itself in the end. So this is something that is, we think, a very meaningful commitment. So let me say a little bit about this. Well, I'm going to say there are 2 kind of hurdles we have to overcome. So one is about the paradigm, and the other one is how do we get private capital into this space, and I think that's our 2 very real challenges. So let me see if I can get this going. Wonderful. So Greg and Naryan talked, about the transformational impact that once you start thinking about nature as infrastructure, and it's about, of course, properly valuing nature. We have heard a lot about this, and it's about designing financial instruments that allow us to use that value, and also maybe the data that makes it possible to design contracts, and that is very fundamental for any development institution. But it's cannot stop there, and again, Greg and Naryan talked about this. We need to get this into development strategies of countries. We need to get it into investment plans of individual companies. What we are saying, okay, this is a little bit empty words at this point, but I think it's something that, when you get into the spirit of saying that let's look at nature first, when we are identifying in investment needs or rather infrastructure challenges, let's see what nature can do before you move into gray infrastructure. And when you look at gray infrastructure projects, look at how can you use nature along with gray infrastructure to enhance and often make cheaper, actually. And of course, as everyone realizes we need to look beyond individual projects. We need to invest on a landscape scale, and that's where thinking again about nature as infrastructure is important. And of course, move beyond this safeguard approach that we are just want to make sure that we're not doing any damage. We want to look at the upside, and that again, I think is what nature's infrastructure helps us with. And nature's infrastructure gives us both this sense that we want to invest in nature, we want to manage nature, we want to make nature more resilient. And it also brings us a lot of experience from infrastructure finance. It's about what type of instruments to use, how to think about particular investment challenges. And I'll give you a few examples later how I think this can be very productive. But one of the features that we met, and for some of you this may seem somehow primitive, but it's nature. There are no revenue flows, and how do you it's great to think about this, but how do we get it really in practice? This is so far away from any policymakers' thinking. So what we said we would do a report we just launched on where the water flows, and it looks at the thinking about nature's infrastructure in a very specific form, because the global water cycle, what else can you say than it's infrastructure? Take the flying rivers. It brings water, pumps water up in the air. It conveys water. It brings water down. It keeps systemic temperatures. It purifies water as water percolates through nature. So you need to think beyond rivers, lakes, and oceans. The rainfall that comes in flying rivers is the biggest source of fresh water offered by essential land ecological systems. It's cross-border, it's cross-watershed. It's about, of course, upwind deforestation, upstream conservation of forest impact, and downstream hydropower. So investing in nature preserves both blue and green water. So here is just what I just said about this the nature's infrastructure and the global water cycle. So here's the flying rivers. This is work that is in the report. Jingi Gao here has been leading that work, and it really, what we could do is we could look at the flying rivers and establish, how much a country contributes to these flying rivers, how much it receives. And once you start thinking like that, it's not far-fetched to start thinking about, we are used to paying for water, how can we try to monetize these moisture flows? So I just wanted to spend one more moment on the nature's infrastructure and how it's different from nature-based solutions, because I think we all try to use nature-based solutions in specific investment contexts and so on. But for us, a nature-based solution is about looking at the possibility of using nature to address a particular challenge, while nature's infrastructure, again, it's about thinking at the system level, about thinking on how can we combine a lot of nature-based solutions, how can we improve the operation of the ecosystem as a whole. And we have a good example. We are working on a project in Ulaanbaatar in Inner Mongolia. The policymakers, the local administration came to us and said, we want to use a part of a wetland to restore that to manage floods. And we said, let's have a look at this using natural capital valuation methodology. And when we came back to them and said, look at the value that you're bringing through this wetland in terms of cross-pollination, in terms of carbon capture, water and air purification and so on, recreation, then you should restore the whole wetland. And that's what they are intending to do now. And I think that is sort of a good example of how you move from nature-based solutions to nature's infrastructure. So the other challenge is, again, to a local authority or a government can say that we do internalize these values that this wetland produces. But really to bring in scale to this, you need to bring in the private sector. And that was another pushback from some of our investment teams saying, you're going to distort our commitment to have 50% private finance by pushing nature. So we wanted to show them, and we launched together with European Bank Reconstruction and Development and the Paulson Institute in Belém, a report on where we try to apply this infrastructure terminology or contractual structures to different projects. And really the idea here is just to, instead of talking about built, talk about restore, and then it all falls into place, and you will meet some of these examples during the next couple of days here. Let me end with our first real nature finance project that we took it to board last week. It's an example of how you can bring in private sector finance into nature as infrastructure. So we are on lending to 2 commercial banks in the project that passed last week. It was to one bank, a Chinese bank, medium-sized by Chinese standards, but by global standards, very, very big, maybe a top 10 in Europe or something like that. And what we are committing to say, we on-lend you this money, you going to lend to nature's infrastructure projects. We get some concessional finance from Tencent and AFD to train the bankers to use taxonomy, which is a taxonomy that we have agreed as MDBs, and also the Chinese Central Bank has now agreed on. And they apply this taxonomy on these sub-projects, and then we can very easily scale up this. I've seen this done in, for energy efficiency, for women entrepreneurs and so on. Once one bank takes on this, it's going to very quickly scale up. But we have another project in the pipeline, another Chinese bank that is doing this. Of course, what you need here is very much some kind of policy framework at the bottom, and this is where the great work on the gross ecological product that Professor Ouyang has been working on. That's now the basis for the eco-compensation mechanism in China, and that is raising the bankability of these sub-projects in this final project. So let me summarize. So really the challenge is, we need to mobilize capital. We need to get private capital into this space as well. We think that viewing nature as infrastructure is a very powerful way to make this happen and scale. We think that using this PPP for nature framework coming from infrastructure finance will allow financial institutions also to come in to support nature capital, nature's infrastructure. And finally, we need the valuation models, we need the policy alignment and regulation, and we need to use all these traditional risk mitigation instruments that they use in infrastructure finance. So go back to that first slide I showed on the flying rivers. Just as a thought experiment, assume that we could charge the tariffs. We would see, and we show very clearly, that emerging and developing economies are massive net contributors to these flying rivers. Imagine if we can charge, or take it the other way. Imagine that countries that are the beneficiaries now, you can see here the United States, particularly the south and the east of United States, are benefiting from the Amazon. If we could convince policymakers here that indeed this moisture is critical for their agriculture, not only for agriculture, but for so many sectors, they should be willing to invest in ensuring the resilience of the Amazon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erik. Next up, we have Matthew Bardrick, who is the senior economist at the Senior Economist, International Biodiversity and Climate in the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA.
Hi, and thank you first for having me present today amongst such esteemed fellow panelists. For the past 10 years, I've worked as a senior economist focusing on how we integrate nature into policy and decision-making on UK's domestic environment goals. However, going right back, I often joke that I started my career selling thin air for a living. It wasn't quite thin air. I was actually involved in the sale of radio waves, the rights to use different frequency spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we did that with auctions. And now, for the economists in your room, that might sound incredibly interesting, but I don't think that was the most interesting thing that I learned there. If you'd gone back 30 years and told people that companies would one day pay billions of pounds for licenses to use invisible radio waves, and that investment would in turn completely transform how we live and work on the go, that would have sounded crazy. Certainly in the UK and many other countries around the world, the 3G spectrum auctions had companies making unprecedented investments in something that in the past they'd just been given for free. What fascinated me was not that the spectrum was valuable, we already knew that, and the technology to use it was developing really rapidly. The really interesting part was how we managed to turn that potential straight off the bat into big investment. Telco companies invested billions, backed by their large institutional investors, because governments had created something much more important. They'd created confidence around the value through clear rights, trusted institutions, common standards, and regulatory certainty. And once that happened, investment scaled, markets developed, innovation accelerated, and technologies we have now seemed completely speculative and are a huge part of everyday life. Now, I won't profess that's a perfect segue, but I think natural capital's not that dissimilar to spectrum. Not because forests are like telco networks, or because wetlands are like mobile phones, but because we already know nature is valuable. And most people in this room will have settled that question years ago. The consensus is also ever growing, increasingly through great work and collaboration between governments, academia, and multilaterals on initiatives like the TFND, and demonstrated by the agreement of the IPBES Biodiversity Summary for Policymakers, which has also been mentioned, which we were very happy to host the agreement for in Manchester in February. I'm glad to say that businesses are also increasingly understanding it too. So as a policymaker, I have to ask myself, how do we create or transform the institutions, standards, and the evidence to make the confidence that allows value to shape decisions and the investment at scale? How do we move from understanding nature's importance, the first goal of the Natural Capital Alliance back in the day, to changing public spending decisions, changing development decisions, and changing investment decisions? In the UK, we've been trying to transform how nature plays into our economy for quite a while. Institutionalize it into scale to involve the real economy in nature action. And you're certainly not looking at an economy transformed, quite far from it. An insight that I always try to stress is that in the UK, we've come to realize that a whole suite of interventions over time is needed, and it's really hard. Changes to the machinery of government, national accounts, economic appraisal, and how that can then feed into infrastructure decisions, business cases. How people understand risk management differently, and increasingly, how can we have conversations about investment in finance? We've, of course, done a lot of this within government, but as the IPBES Transformational Change Assessment demonstrates, we need to work together across the economy to do this, to ensure we're transitioning to a world where nature's role is properly recognised. In the UK, recognising and demonstrating the value of nature continues to be really important. and we continue to evolve this picture both at a strategic and a program level. Our national level natural capital accounts, alongside our HM Treasury Green Book enabling a natural capital approach guidance, including its value data books, have been around for a while. These set out the value of our domestic environment to the economy and commit us to including them in public decision making, as well as reducing the costs for partners to do this. Also worth mentioning that the OECD are also looking to develop these international value factors as part of their current Innovate project, if any of you are involved in that. Most recently, we've also worked across government on a first-of-its-kind nature security report, which is demonstrating international nature's role in our national security. As others have mentioned, this has brought new allies from across government and internationally as they understand that the risk for nature and not acting on threats supports their own outcomes. But we've also been putting measures to set the foundations and confidence and sometimes compulsion for the rest of the economy and those in government to act whose primary concern isn't for nature. To do this, we've aimed to create confidence through commitments and provide metrics so people know that we will value nature investment and positive actions into the future. At a strategic level, we've legislated. We've set some legally binding nature targets as part of our Environment Act, and the need for us to have long-term plans to meet them in the form of our 25-year environment plan and 5 yearly environment improvement plans that set out how to get us there. We've also committed ministers across government and public sector bodies to take due regard to a set of environmental principles and to improve biodiversity directly. We hope these give the confidence and as much certainty as we can that the path forward will not yo-yo with the changes in government. We've had a lot of different prime ministers recently. And more directly, we've legislated developers to provide net gain for biodiversity when building and work with academics and our delivery partners to create metrics to govern that process. This requires them to value and replace habitat they once freely exploited. I'm also proud to say that we've worked together with international partners through the World Bank Programme on Sustainability and other initiatives like UNDP Biofin to support other economies on this journey too. But we recognise that there's still a lot of further work to send stronger signals through further regulatory levers, corporate disclosure standards, and other initiatives to unlock greater demand and provide confidence for investors and the rest of businesses. That's why we've been co-developing nature-positive pathways with the World Wildlife Fund, the Green Finance Institute, and leading businesses to set out the actions that key sectors need to take to support nature's recovery. The first 3 of these are the agri-food sector, water, and the built environment. We've also committed to increasing water industry investment through further legislative reforms. And the technology's failed. We're also working across government to improve corporate sustainability reporting, both on the transition plans, as I mentioned, to provide the markets with credible, decision-useful information on how they should transition to net zero and nature positive. And we've also been working really closely with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures framework. Raising integrity of nature markets through high standards and clear governance is also vital for ensuring that trust and confidence. So we've sponsored the British Standards Institute to launch a suite of nature investment standards so that buyers and investors can be assured of the environmental integrity of nature projects and credits. And we're consulting on the next steps for voluntary and nature markets. But we also know that businesses looking to invest in nature projects need a financial return. They need to do this at scale, and that's often larger than some nature projects can supply. So we've built the ability of over 130 local authorities, ENGOs, farmers, and land managers to become investment ready through our Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund and Local Investment in Natural Capital Programme. Most interestingly, we've invested 30 million in the new Big Nature Impact Fund, where we, as government, take on more of the financial risk, making it less risky for private investors to get involved. The first close of this fund exceeded expectations, quite small still, with 64.6 million, but that was working towards a target of 120 million. And the investors were really diverse, from individuals, insurers, to impact investors, who'd never invested in nature assets before. So in close, a lesson to take from both Spectrum and my work on natural capital is that value alone won't just drive transformation. Institutions do. So as governments, we create frameworks and incentives. Academics can help strengthen the evidence base. Philanthropy can pioneer new approaches. Businesses and investors help scaling them. And our colleagues at MDBs occupy a uniquely important space to help countries move from promising projects to systematic change. The challenge is not to prove nature is valuable, but for us to build confidence in the institutions so that we can shape decisions at scale. Thanks.
And finally, for this session, we have Mary Ruckelshaus, whose official title is Senior Fellow Natural Capital Alliance, but she's also the Executive Director Emeritus and architect of so much of what we've been able to do at the Natural Capital Project and Alliance. Thank you, Mary.
Hi, everyone. This is a great to see everybody, but it's also a great suite of speakers to follow for today for what I want to share, which is these lessons from this group that you've heard about working together in 16 countries with 3 multilateral development banks, the IDB, the Asian Development Bank, and the World Bank, and this Natural Capital Alliance in the room. And what we have learned, you've heard a little bit about this morning, and you'll hear more about this afternoon and over the next couple of days. But I'll give you my punchline, because the way I've been thinking about this project over the last 5 years is that we were really pushing, how do you go from the idea that nature matters to people, which many more people, of course everyone in this room, but many more people around the world understand, and how do you use that knowledge in your heart and your head to drive changes in policy and changes in investment. And what I've come to decide is that we're basically, this transformation, we're building an immune system for countries and governments and the world. And that immune system will then allow an immune response when a shock comes, when a disaster comes, when an opportunity arises. And that is what I'll tell you a little bit about what we've learned. What does that immune system look like in this portfolio that we've been working in over the last 5 years? And I'm going to use our friends from Belize as an example of one key component of this immune system is that you have to engage the dream team. So the dream team in Belize is many people, but the Honorable Beverly Wade is here. She's the CEO of which is the way that Belizeans call ministers of the Department of Blue Economy and Marine Conservation. And Beverly, we've worked with for over a decade. She's a visionary leader who comes from a fisheries background, so she's grounded in a very important economic sector in Belize, but she also has this intangible ability to listen and lead and be a diplomat among her colleagues in different sectors in Belize, which she now has to engage in her new leadership role, where tourism and forestry and several other sectors are inside her ministry. When we last started working with Beverly at the beginning of this 5-year project, she introduced us to, this is Prime Minister Briceño, who was also the finance minister, and his colleague, Mr. Christopher Coy. And she brought us in to say, we need to get the finance ministry at the heart of this work we're doing together to push Belize into the next generation of incorporating nature in its economy. And it's just one example out of many of what we learn when we speak to leaders in different sectors. So Mr. Coy and Prime Minister Briceño said, at the second slide, we had this beautiful presentation prepared, and we had a lot of language like nature positive and incorporating nature in decisions. And Mr. Coy said, I need people positive. That's my job. My job as the finance minister and Mr. Briceño as the prime minister of this country, we need interventions in policy and finance that will help people. And of course, in our engagements, people positive is part of this nature and ecosystem service and natural capital approach, but we weren't talking about it that way. So without leaders like Beverly and Prime Minister Briceño and Mr. Coy from Finance Ministry, we would be speaking about these opportunities in not a very compelling way. As Aileen said, we want to make this irresistible for people, and to do that, we have to listen to the leaders who know their country best. So this is the portfolio of countries. Again, you can come and hear about this more this afternoon. But looking at the different ways that these approaches can be accelerated around the globe and through the crucial scaling roles that the multilateral development banks play has really helped us lay out a roadmap for what's next. So this is a slide maybe some of you have seen. I'm not going to walk through it. It just emphasizes how much work there is, technical and policy and social and economic, underlying all of these efforts. So you're trying to take nature's benefits to people and turn them into more visible metrics. And then in going through these different metrics and measures of values, you get a more prosperous and sustainable future. But if you think about this, how does this actually happen? And the way it happens is through engagement with dream teams like in Belize and elsewhere. So that is one of the key lessons that we learned in this last 5 years, is getting an engagement by the right people who can help solve these next level innovations that are needed is the crucial element of the success for this scaling. So again, these are the very diverse policies and investments that were moved along in significant ways in each of these 16 countries with the co-leadership by the development banks. So just to say, it was a diverse set of opportunities. But as this print shows, most of what we do is not limited by technical analysis. If you think about transforming a landscape like this, and more than 85% of the Earth's surface is somehow been impacted by people, and people are integrating and interacting with it. Therefore, we need this immune response to include institutions and governance and individual leaders that will make these changes happen. It's not just methodology, and it's not just data, which is a lot of the innovation, but there's not been enough attention, we've all decided, on the governance and the institutions and the people capacity who can carry this work forward. So I'm just going to give 3 quick examples of what we have seen that encourages durability in impact. So I'm going to use China and Belize as the first 2 examples because they have been working on this and wrestling with incorporating nature into policy and finance for longer than many countries around the world. And as you can understand, they could not be more different. And then I'll give an interesting sort of hot off the press story in Chile that friends in the room can tell you more about. So the common elements, in spite of these very distinctly different geographies and cultures and governance structures, is this adaptive governance, this learning mindset, focus on capacity, and real finance that's linked early on. These are what we've seen in both China and Belize, and it has resulted in a lasting commitment to taking nature into their policy and investment and continuing to grow that. So China's durability factors and outcomes some of them are listed here. Again, you can hear much more about this from our Chinese experts here in the room, and they'll be speaking tomorrow afternoon in a GEP session and also this afternoon. But a couple of highlights. One thing that both China and Belize have in common, they have codified in their laws that they must do a natural capital spatial assessment for their country every 5 years. And that becomes the baseline data and information from which so much innovation flows. They learn a lot about what's changing, about where people are benefiting and where people are losing benefits. China has been implementing, this is all about implementation, as you heard a little bit this morning, some really novel policy mechanisms. And these then lead investment, significant investment in numbers of people, households, and yuan in many regions based on these regularly occurring ecosystem assessments. And this is also really driving stewardship. So we have friends here from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and many of you in the room have studied and are understanding the importance of stewardship as part of helping ecosystems recover and bring benefits ongoing to people. And if you pay people for stewardship, the way China has been spearheading in incredible examples, then that can become a more lasting benefit. And then this livelihood connection. So this is the same as in Belize. If you connect nature to growth in livelihoods and security of livelihoods, then it becomes irresistible, as Aileen Lee said earlier. So really briefly, Belize, very similar set of lists of innovations here. It has a requirement for a natural capital assessment that they do every 5 years. They learn, they improve through monitoring, and this gives them a way to integrate through their Coastal Zone Management Authority and Institute, their fisheries, their forestry, their tourism, and their climate sectors all integrate to share data and learn over time how the benefits are flowing into the different parts of the economy. As Greg mentioned, they have now developed a key performance indicator system that's supported by a monitoring, reporting, and verification process that then can help them give confidence to investors. So there are blue bonds, there's this project for finance permanence, there's more private money coming into Belize, thanks in large part to the Inter-American Development Bank. But without Belize's commitment to monitoring and learning about what interventions are working and what is not working, this finance would not be flowing so freely. So this is another way to show how do you build a dream team. So this immune system that we're seeing that we need really takes a lot of effort from very different interests across a country's economy, from civil society, and crucially from financing institutions. So the development banks being part of these integrated teams in these 16 countries where we worked were crucial to mobilizing finance from the beginning. They understood what the government was hoping to achieve, helped co-design the solutions, and then the loans and the financing was teed up and ready to go much more quickly. So lastly, just to say a little bit more about this science policy engagement process. So Chile is a really interesting, relatively newer example. It's a little bit more recent than Belize and China's history, but they've used innovative governance. So there's a natural capital committee, and Elias is here from Chile's central bank who's part of that. We have a team here led by Hector Angarita and others who have worked with this cross-sectoral natural capital committee now through, it's on its third president. And so they're trying to work cross-sectorally, led by Ministry of Environment and Finance, to mainstream these approaches across the sectors from the top in Chile and also working from the bottom in the different provinces. And one really great story that will touch some of the academics in this room, the fact that there was an IDB and ministers of finance and economic development and forestry and tourism, many ministries across the Natural Capital Committee, and academics from Chile working together. The academic researchers now have a much closer relationship with the government officials, and that pipeline of new students getting trained has been opened up and with direct access to what the Natural Capital Committee is working on. And those relationships, as you know, can be tricky to unlock, and this process has helped do that. And one more example I'll give with Belize. This is in the middle of that picture there is Leroy Martinez, who is in the Ministry of Economic Transformation. And he was part of the dream team in Belize, as was Omar and now Pauline Blanc from IDB. And they got to know each other. They basically became friends traveling around the country, flying up here to come present their work at this symposium. And that relationship has helped, by their own admission, unlock much more rapid financing because IDB, Greg mentioned IDB Klima this morning, and Omar knew that IDB Klima was a new financing stream coming out and was ready for willing countries around Latin America and the Caribbean to take that up. And because of the long waits in plane rides, Leroy and Omar hatched a plan that Belize would become one of the first countries to get that financing. So it's these little moments among leaders that often don't meet with one another where some of the spark and the acceleration can happen. Okay, and I'll close with this slide, which is, this is not easy. So Taylor Ricketts this morning talked about one of the things he was surprised and disappointed about was that this wasn't just getting taken up faster. These compelling ideas, nature clearly matters to people, that's our life support system. Why isn't it just taking off? And part of the reason is that because we're talking about transforming societies, but I also think some of the reason is that we're not paying enough attention to the governance innovations like what Belize and China have done and Chile. Those are incredible innovations that other countries can learn from, and so let's help spread those. Maybe the development banks can help, maybe some academic treatments of governance innovation that really helps move the needle faster. And then the institutions and building capacity and better, deeper connections between research institutions and the immediate implementers in government and private sector. I think those really need our attention, more direct sort of focus on the how. How do we build these dream teams and how do we keep them going? Because transformation is really just people acting differently. So with that, I'll close and thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you, Mary. I would now like to invite all of the speakers back up for a panel discussion. And you're probably getting a little sick of me, so I'm going to invite Lisa to moderate this panel.
Thanks, Anne. Can folks hear me? Yes, this is on. Thank you all for those great presentations. I'm going to pick up on a theme. Oh, Ryan. Now we have everybody. I'm going to pick up on a theme, Aileen, that you introduced on your question of what does collaboration look like to meet our ambitions. And this first question I'm going to throw to our development bank colleagues here, Greg and Erik and Naryan. Can you tell us, we heard in your talks some of the amazing work that each of your institutions is advancing on bringing natural capital approaches into policy and finance. Can you speak to how the MDBs are working together and sharing best practices to advance these efforts?
You want to start? You want me to start? Okay. So yeah, I mean, the good part of MDBs is, and there are several good parts, is that we think and work pretty similarly. But the better part is that we work in different regions, mainly. So we are able to naturally collaborate, more. The drawback, of course, is that we are usually, so busy with our own, engagements and problems that we don't bother to collaborate. But in this case, after COP26, I think, was it? MDBs got together and actually expanded the group, and 10 IFIs got together and signed a joint statement on nature. And that was actually a very, very significant milestone, I would say, especially with respect to collaborating or coming together for natural capital, investments. Because there we got together and we had a 5-point, statement wherein we agreed to work together, think together, and I don't recollect the statement really, but this was the gist of it. And one of the things I would like to really talk about from that statement is our, agreement to at least begin looking at our own portfolios and seeing what we are financing that, that is actually attributable to nature. And the next logical question was, how do you define that? So agreeing on a definition of what constitutes nature positive finance. So this, we then agreed on a common taxonomy of nature finance. What constitutes, how do you define it and how do you track it? And we've been then, trying to establish common standards and having everyone look at nature in the same way at least helps us to measure where we are, and then if you want, set milestones, set targets, or at least look back and see, why we did not achieve what we wanted to do. Maybe, correct certain perspectives, wrong perspectives that might have prevailed earlier, so just measuring something always, produces better performance, and this is what, the important thing that I would like to point out. Maybe Greg would supplement.
Maybe I can jump in also, because I think there's like formal collaboration, there's informal collaboration. On the formal side, so yeah, there was the joint statement back in Glasgow, which, the UK pushed very heavily as the person who was trying to get it signed by everybody. It's hard to get those things signed, so it's not a small feat, right? Building off of that, we did the tracking work, but we also then created a nature heads working group where so the nature heads of each of the institutions meet quarterly, and then we have a Sherpa group that kind of brings the work forward in between, focused on specific areas. And so there was the tracking. Another was the metrics work that I showed, where we said, look, we're facing this challenge with metrics. We know that this is holding others back too. Let's put our brains together. And then the way it works is like, the MDB that kind of has some funding and some interest raises their hand. In that case, it was EIB and IDB. We said, we'll fund this. Let's do it. And everybody works together on it together. We have another working group right now working on biodiversity credit and nature credit markets that we're leading with EIB. As a subgroup, that we're going to try to release some papers at COP17 about how MDBs can support nature credit markets. What are the mechanisms? What are we all doing? Taking stock of what each other are doing so that we can learn. So that's kind of the formal agenda. But then there's also the informal agenda. And I would say that NatCap has actually tremendously strengthened that. Because I think back to when I first came here, and Qingfeng is probably somewhere in the audience, and he said to me, like, I saw you guys created a natural capital lab. We want to do the same thing. Like, can you talk to us about how you did that? And we did. And then, I was invited to also talk about how we did our debt for nature swaps and transfer that knowledge. At the same time, we were getting all this great knowledge from the Asian Development Bank on the work with gross ecosystem product and the work in some of the pilots they were doing that we could then take into our countries. And so with Colombia, we tried to kind of say, what would a Colombian version of gross ecosystem product work like? So there is also that knowledge sharing aspect that I think is really important that actually is very much facilitated by the Alliance.
Yeah, one thing that I was worried about when we as a newcomer came into this space was that, here's competition, here's, someone coming to tread on our turf, and Naryan is right that, there is some geographic difference, but we work both in Asia and in Latin America, and so for us, or for me also personally, I thought it was something that would be kind of resented that we came in, but it's been the opposite, really very welcoming, very willing to share experience. In the beginning, as a small development bank, we had to co-finance. We didn't have many people to support individual investment. So we are now the largest co-financier of ADB and the World Bank. And of course, in this space, I think it's even more important that we do that type of co-financing. I was part of the reviewing their latest nature report from ADB. I think it was a very interesting conversations we had. We are doing some pilots on biodiversity credits in China together with the International Advisory Panel of Biodiversity Credits. We have invited ADB to join there as well. So I think this is not the problem. I think this is it's just something we need to do more of course, and find different context in which we can collaborate, but it's a very, a very willing community to work with.
So for my second question here, I'm again coming back to your remarks, Aileen, and this question will be for Matt and Mary and Aileen. This community is very focused on scaling natural capital approaches. That's the theme of this session. Aileen, you said it's for a long time felt tantalizingly out of reach. If each of you, if you could choose one thing that we, being collectively this community in the room, should do to scale more quickly or effectively, what would that be?
I can start. I think one thing for me, and others have touched on it, is for us not to get bogged down in the language or bogged down into the detail. I think quite often we find that, if you've not got the data, it scares people because people think they should, have natural capital accounts. And for me, it's not natural capital. Erik started his presentation presented his presentation on nature's infrastructure. And we had a great event in London at the end of London Climate Action last week, which Nicola Ranger and colleagues at LSE organised on nature's infrastructure. And, bringing those into the equation, finding those new allies, I think is really what's going to scale this. Not focusing too much on the scary numbers and the data.
I guess I want to pick up on something Greg said that I've been thinking about. So I think you said in your presentation that you wanted to do not just the novel things, but the kind of boring things that are proven. And I actually think there's an element of this next phase of work is about being willing to lean into the things that make these natural capital investments boring, right? In the sense that they have that ability to be so clearly measurable, verifiable, and understood in a way that the kind of blended capital solutions that everybody was talking about can bring on private sector financing in that kind of vanilla way that the private sector wants to engage, much more possible. And then I think the other thought I would add to that, having also been last week at London Climate Action Week, and I think every single night at a slightly different dinner that was a version of raising money for these kind of blended finance solutions, with the exception of the TFFF, right, which is truly swinging for the fences. Most of these we're hoping to catalyze on the order of, less than $1 billion, which is great, but it's not quite right at that level of how do we really make these replicated? Because obviously the reason I was doing these sequential dinners is because putting that capital stack together each time is a lot of work, right? So I guess I would ask, with the ingredients we have and the visibility around priorities, which it sounds like we already have, what does it look like to make it easier to bring these capital stacks together so that we can start reaching for a larger scale?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, so I'll just add, and then share that, so that we have this new massive open online course, this new MOOC that has lessons from this portfolio of 16 countries with a focus on the LAC countries, but we have learned a lot, as you said, and whatever this financing stack looks like, or what are some of the solutions that have been emerging, and can we wrap those into courses or ways to get out to the people who are implementing right now, not sort of like, there's a lot of new research needed, of course there's always gaps, but there is a lot that has been worked out, and could we more quickly accelerate that through, I don't know the mechanisms, you guys probably know better, but yeah.
Your point about making this boring resonates. I was in a meeting 2 weeks ago where that was another theme of make natural capital boring, and maybe that's the metric of success we should be looking for when it really is vanilla and usual. We've again had more people with expertise to contribute than we've had seats on the stage. So to end the session, I would like to invite a colleague from the African Development Bank, Dr. Innocent Ona, I believe is here, to come up and introduce himself. And given the time, we can pose a question for further reflection as we move on. Here. Oh.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Innocent Ona. I work for the African Development Bank as Chief Natural Resources Officer. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Natural Capital Alliance for inviting the African Development Bank. And we were trying to have this conversation, and most of my colleagues, whom I know very well, at the MDB working group on nature. This conversation has been going on for some time, and the African Development Bank is already accelerating actions on the ground as well. So I just wait to see what kind of contributions we could make, knowledge that we could also share, and also learn, from this group. So I'm happy to be here, and I know there's a session by 3:30, and maybe at that point I could also share more. But I'm available to answer any question that you may have, so as to contribute to the discussion as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll just end by saying it's really striking the work that the institutions that you all represent are doing individually and collectively. Again, it's not just about the data and about the information, but really transforming institutions to make all this mainstream and boring. So this gives me hope, coming back to the question I think Gretchen posed earlier this morning. So we have, after this session, we're all going to take photos out front. But before we do that, can you please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.
Thank you.